What is the statistically best movie of 2018? I'm here to analyze all the numbers and tell you what the best movie is of this past year. Welcome, and if this is your first time here, my YouTube channel is all about movies. Today I'm talking about the statistically best movie of 2018. I crunched all the numbers and looked at everything from box office to reviews to talk about some of the best movies of the past year. Now, if you're interested in my personal favorite movies of 2018, I actually will link to that on my blog. I wrote a whole post about it. I figured everybody over here on YouTube's doing their best movies of the year, and I do something a little bit different. So it's kind of a loaded question as to what the best movie is of the past year. So I actually broke it down into a couple different categories. First off is best reviewed movie on average with Rotten Tomatoes, Metacritic, IMDb. We'll get into that. We'll get into the best box office opening, domestic, worldwide, and best per theater average. So let's get right into it. What are the best reviewed movies of 2018? Well, as I said, I took a look at the score given from IMDb, Metacritic, and Rotten Tomatoes and averaged them out. I actually got this idea from reading Entertainment Weekly's magazine, where they did something very similar, and this is for up until today's date. So this is the list of the top 10. I'm just going to read it in order, give you some of the interesting movies. Number one is Roma. That received a very high score from all of the movie sites, and it actually doesn't have a 100% on Rotten Tomatoes like some of these other movies, which is interesting. And depending on where you go for a lot of these reviews, you'll get different opinions, different ideas, but overall this is just a general consensus on how good these movies are. So Roma's number one. A couple of these movies you maybe never heard of. I actually haven't. I've only seen 3 of these movies on the list. That's Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, Won't You Be My Neighbor, and 8th Grade. I've heard great things this year about Roma and about The Favorite. Roma, in case you don't know, that's about the life of a maid in Mexico in the 1970s. It's directed by Alfonso Cuarón, who directed a lot of different masterpiece movies, and it's getting some high praise this year. You can actually watch it on Netflix right now if you're interested. So those are the top reviewed movies of 2018. Let's get into the box office a little bit. First off, let's talk about opening weekends. So when a movie opens, the box office is calculated for Friday through Sunday, and the best movies, this is actually a really great year for openings. The number one movie opening of all time was this past year, and 3 of the top 10 are in the top 10 of all time. So going down the list, Avengers Infinity War was actually the number one opening this past year, and it's the number one opening of all time, beating out Force Awakens, a couple other Star Wars movies, Jurassic World, and it opened to $257 million, which is unreal. And it's interesting to see whether the next movie will actually beat that, and there are a couple of movies that have potential to beat that opening weekend record. Then actually, Black Panther is the number 6 opening of all time, and Incredibles 2 is the number 9 opening of all time. The rest of these movies did pretty well. Just some things to note is that Solo, A Star Wars Story, is the lowest opening for a Star Wars film in the new age of Star Wars. It was a bit of a disappointment of a film, and money-wise, I mean, it still made a lot of money, but not great. Halloween is also another important thing to note. Their movie made $76 million opening weekend. Now, it's not the highest horror movie opening of all time, but it still did very well and kind of snuck in there. It's not on these other lists that I'll get to in a bit, but that's why I wanted to note it. Aquaman this past weekend was actually just a little bit under 200,000 away from cracking that top 10. But they didn't make it. The Aquaman, it was actually number 11 on the list. Next up, let's take a look at the domestic and see what grossed the highest this past year in total gross. So on this list, Black Panther is actually number 1. It beat out Avengers Infinity War, which blows my mind because you'd think that a lot of the people that are going to see Black Panther are also going to go see Avengers Infinity War. I don't know what the demographic is of people that didn't go to see Infinity War that saw Black Panther. So this is just strange to me that Infinity War didn't beat out Black Panther for the number 1 grossing. Now, it was pretty close. It was a little bit away, but it's still pretty cool. You have Incredibles 2 again, Jurassic World, Deadpool 2, which is another great high-grossing movie, and Dr. Seuss's The Grinch, which was in my opinion, wasn't the best film of the year, but the kids love it, and that's great, and that's why I think it's grossing so much. Now, this movie is grossing a lot domestically in the US, but not necessarily worldwide. So that's something important to note. You also notice that there's an absence of Fantastic Beasts in here, which actually we'll get to a little bit later, see if that makes the worldwide list. Then you have a lot of your other big blockbuster films. I mean, that's what a lot of these highest grossing movies are. It's not those little Oscar films or the little indie films that, you'll hear high praise for. And that's why a lot of these lists, from the highest reviewed movies to the highest grossing, there's not necessarily a lot of crossover there, because they don't open in a lot of theaters, whereas these movies open in 4,000 theaters worldwide. And that kind of brings us to the worldwide box office, the total gross of each of these movies. So here you can see in this top 10 list that Avengers Infinity War actually does beat out Black Panther. So Infinity War takes the gauntlet there, no pun intended with the gauntlet. There are two movies on this list that crack the top 10 highest grossing movies of all time. Number one, of course, on that list is Avatar, which came out, a few years back. But number 4 at this time is Avengers Infinity War, grossing over $200 billion at the box office. That's billion with a B. Absolutely unreal how much money this made. And Black Panther made $1.3 billion as well, cracking number 9 on the top 10 of all time. A couple other important things to note. Venom actually made a lot at the worldwide box office. It didn't do that. I mean, it did great domestically, but it did even better overseas. And a couple other things you'll see that cracked the top 10 is Bohemian Rhapsody, which is doing very well and is actually not even finished with its complete run yet. And then Fantastic Beasts cracked that spot just barely. Now, this may end up getting beat out by Aquaman, which is in its early stages of its theater run. And it has okay reviews, and it's actually opened up. It has almost 500 million at the box office right now. That number will probably creep up and end up beating Fantastic Beasts, but it'll be interesting to see how well that movie does in the long run. The last thing I want to get into is the average gross per theater. So every movie opens in a different amount of theaters, and it ends up being in between 3,000, 4,000. Little films are actually, they may only be in like 50 theaters. So it's interesting to see how well the movies gross per theater. And number 1 actually is Black Panther. So again, this beats out Infinity War. It's a flip-flop. Not by a significant amount, but still pretty decent. You see that Dr. Seuss's The Grinch is in there again. A lot of these other films, they make an appearance again. Ant-Man and the Wasp, Mission Impossible, they're all in there. And one important thing to note is actually A Star is Born. So A Star is Born wasn't in any of these other lists. It was close to cracking them, but on the theater average, it actually did very, very well, which is a nice stat to look at. And Crazy Rich Asians, it was another movie that I want to note that wasn't necessarily on all of these other lists, but it's just there. Great film. Statistically speaking, what is the best movie of 2018? Well, I have to give the edge to Avengers Infinity War. It's the highest opening weekend of all time. It's number 4 in the highest grossing movies of all time, and it did very well critically. With my average that I've had, it actually has like a 79 between Rotten Tomatoes, Metacritic, and IMDb. A very close second is Black Panther. It was critically acclaimed and has some Oscar buzz going about it. It is one of the highest openings of all time. It's number 9 at all time at the highest grossing of the box office worldwide, and it was the top domestic movie of this past year. A third movie that kind of creeps up in there and that got a little bit overshadowed, and because it's actually not complete with its run, is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. This movie at one point it had 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. It may still have 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, but we'll see how well this movie grosses because it's done well so far. and as a Spider-Man movie, as a superhero movie, it's done well. So, really the best movies of the year are Avengers Infinity War and Black Panther. They crushed it at the box office. They absolutely dominated. And with Avengers Endgame coming out next year, Disney and Marvel are set to crush the box office in 2019. If you're interested in more statistic videos and box office videos like this, I'd appreciate if you'd subscribe to my channel to get all of the up-to-date news on the latest box office and what's happening. Next year is going to be a very interesting year to analyze between Avengers Endgame and Star Wars Episode 9, along with a lot of other movies coming out. I have a bunch of videos coming out where I analyze Disney versus the world and can Disney be beat at the box office? So I appreciate if you comment on what movie you're most excited for next year, and I'll see you next time.